Marquis Demas Dietrion walked into the art store, ready to expand his collection. The gallery director eagerly attended to him, introducing a particular piece with a flourish. He explained it was the work of a rising star in the art world, fresh from winning acclaim at the Academy Art Exhibition. The painting, he said, depicted the moon goddess, embodying the divine and unattainable desires of humanity. The Marquis, seated and tapping his chair absent-mindedly, listened before remarking dryly, "Cliché." The director froze, then quickly bowed his head in apology, his earlier confidence crumbling like a poorly baked soufflé. Internally, he cursed himself for misjudging the Marquis, wondering what kind of masterpiece could possibly satisfy a collector of such refined tastes. This was, after all, the most demanding patron he'd ever had, and losing him would be unthinkable. As usual, the director promised the Marquis that the pieces he had selected would be delivered to his residence, silently vowing to impress him next time. Yet the Marquis cared little for the fame of the artists or their accolades. His true interest lay in the subject matter, nudes. Though he couldn't quite explain his fascination, he suspected it was the kind of curiosity that often led to awkward conversations and raised eyebrows. As the staff packed the selected frames, the Marquis's attention was caught by another artwork leaning against the wall. He asked about it, and the director stammered, waving it off as a subpar piece. Naturally, this only made the Marquis more curious. Ignoring the director's protests, he strode over to the frame. The director hesitated, explaining that the piece was rough, unpolished, and lacked the sophistication expected for someone of the Marquis's refined taste. While the model had a decent figure, the painting itself felt awkward and stiff, more like a student's first attempt than a masterpiece. When pressed about the artist, the director admitted no formal debut had been made, but promised to send details later. The Marquis didn't seem convinced, but left without another word, leaving the director silently praying he hadn't just doomed himself. Meanwhile, Miss Rodeis, the new tutor at the Pendant's mansion, was growing popular with the family's only daughter. One afternoon, the girl confided in her, complaining about her parents' obsession with collecting art. She dramatically declared that their home looked more like a gallery than a house, and worried aloud that they might lose everything if this craze continued. She explained that Bjorno had been gripped by an art fever for years. Miss Rodeis, trying to hide her amusement, responded with mild surprise, "Well, it's certainly better than stamp collecting." Their chat was interrupted by the girl's mother, who walked in cradling a new painting. The girl ran to hug her, calling her Mama in the sweetest tone, which earned her an equally affectionate reply. The mother thanked Miss Rodeis for her hard work and invited her to join them for tea, mentioning some fancy treats they'd just received. The tutor politely declined, though she appreciated the kind gesture. The mother then sighed in relief, confessing how grateful she was to have found a capable tutor after the abrupt departure of the last one. She asked Miss Rodeis about her background, noting she wasn't from Brno. When the topic of previous employers came up, the tutor hesitated, vaguely saying, "Oh, it's a family you wouldn't know." Before the mother could press further, a staff member appeared and whispered something in her ear. Apologizing, she excused herself, mentioning the arrival of an important guest. She promised to send the treats to Miss Rodeis and left before the tutor could insist it wasn't necessary. Alone, Miss Rodeis chuckled to herself and thought about her friend Corrida, who was probably waiting at home and wondering if she'd smuggled back any of those fancy treats. Riv's attention was drawn to a painting on the wall. She stared at it, wondering what kind of life allowed someone to collect such expensive pieces without a second thought. She admitted to herself that she used to ask those kinds of questions but had long since stopped. That world was far removed from hers, and dreaming about it seemed pointless. She reached out to touch the artwork, but a voice behind her stopped her cold. Quickly pulling her hand back, she thought bitterly that art was a secret she could never let anyone discover. Turning around, she found herself face to face with none other than Marquis Demas Dietrion. The two of them stood in awkward silence, neither saying a word, until a maid appeared, breaking the tension. She addressed Riv first, but froze when her eyes landed on the Marquis. Recognizing him instantly, her tone shifted to one of reverence, bordering on fear. Riv watched the scene unfold and guessed he must be the important guest the Baroness had mentioned earlier. She recalled his reputation as a famously unsociable and wealthy man, known throughout Borno for his aloof and touchy nature. It was practically a miracle to see him anywhere in public. Hesitantly, she asked if he was Lord Dittrion. He frowned, clearly unamused, and demanded to know who she was. Embarrassed, Riv quickly bowed and apologized, stumbling over her words. Before she could finish, the gallery director came rushing in, breathless and panicked. He apologized profusely to the Marquis, explaining there had been a mix-up with the location. The Marquis brushed him off, clearly uninterested in excuses, and turned his attention back to Riv. He repeated his question. Flustered, she introduced herself as Liv Rodeis, a governess at the pendant's estate. He gave her a long look, then remarked that he'd remember her name before turning away without another word. 10 days earlier, Riv had been at Brett's painting store, lost in thought. Her life had taken a sharp turn since her artisan parents had died in a carriage accident, leaving her with a sick younger sister and endless medical bills. As the eldest daughter of a middle-class family, she had taken on more than she could handle and felt completely trapped. She saw herself as incompetent and doubted she'd ever escape the crushing weight of her responsibilities. Brett, the painter, called out to her, snapping her back to reality. He sighed and pointed out that her posture was stiff again, asking what was on her mind. She mumbled an apology. He shook his head and reminded her, half joking, half serious, that a nude model didn't need the poise of a duchess. Riv grumbled internally about her unusual double life as a governess by day and a nude model by necessity. The thought of anyone at the pendant's estate finding out terrified her. But with her sister's medical bills unpaid and her debts growing by the day, she couldn't see a way out. At this point, dignity felt like a luxury she couldn't afford. The painter interrupted Riv's thoughts again, asking if she was sure she wouldn't allow her face to appear in the painting. Startled, she reminded him of their agreement. Only her back would be shown. He tried to persuade her, saying that even a hint of her face would make the painting sell for much more, enough to solve all her financial problems. She firmly refused, though her frustration was evident. Sighing, he relented, and she turned slightly, letting him continue his work. Now, in the present, Riv stormed into Brett's painting room, seething with anger. She accused him of breaking his promise and painting her face. Brett tried to defend himself, saying it was just her profile and no one would recognize her. Furious, she demanded he destroy the painting immediately. When he refused, she grabbed an object, ready to shred the canvas herself. But when she pulled back the covering, she froze. The painting was gone. Brett hesitated before admitting it had already been sold. Horrified, Riv demanded to know if her face was visible in the painting. Her mind spiraled into panic. She imagined the humiliation if her secret were exposed. What would people think of a governess who had posed as a nude model? She couldn't even fathom the consequences. Before she could fully process her fear, a knock came at the door. A visitor announced that he was there to collect the painting. Desperate, Riv rushed to the door and insisted the painting could not be sold because the model had not given her consent. Brett, clearly regretting his life choices, tried to calm her, suggesting they discuss the matter later, but Riv refused to back down. The visitor, looking increasingly uncomfortable, explained that he had no authority over the sale and was only there to retrieve the artwork. He added that the lordship was waiting in his carriage. Riv glanced out the window, spotting an elegant carriage outside, and her heart sank. Was the buyer sitting right there? She silently prayed this disaster could somehow be undone. Moments later, the visitor returned, looking apologetic. The lordship wishes to know why the painting cannot be sold, he said. Brett, sensing an escape route, suggested Riv explain the matter herself. She glared at him, saying through gritted teeth, "He wants to hear it from me? The model?" The visitor nodded. Riv sighed, already regretting everything that had brought her to this moment. Riv explained that, due to the nature of the painting, it was crucial to keep the model's identity confidential, and she did not wish to reveal herself. The man, unfazed, replied that if this wasn't possible, he would either take the painting or require a refund. Brett groaned at the mention of money, and Riv immediately shot him a look. "You gambled again, didn't you?" she asked sharply. He mumbled something incoherent, avoiding her glare. The visitor, clearly eager to wrap things up, handed Riv a card and instructed her to visit the address before evening to resolve the matter. "We can't keep the lordship waiting much longer," he added before leaving. When Riv finally got home, she felt a small wave of relief, knowing the painting hadn't been fully handed over yet. She was greeted by her younger sister, Corda, who ran up to her with a bright smile, calling her name and hugging her tightly. Riv hugged her back, with her exhaustion momentarily melting away. Corda noticed the weariness in her eyes and asked if she'd had a rough day, adding softly, "You've been working so hard." Riv smiled faintly, thinking to herself that as long as they could find a way to make money, they'd be fine. They just needed to figure out a way to keep everything from falling apart, starting with that painting. At the Pendants mansion later that day, Riv approached Lady Pendants, calling out to get her attention. The Baroness turned, her usual composed expression softening slightly. "Yes, Miss Rodeis? Do you need something?" Riv hesitated, her thoughts racing. She considered telling the Baroness everything, but quickly dismissed the idea. It would destroy the fragile trust they'd begun to build. Instead, she smiled nervously and reported that Million had performed exceptionally well in her lesson that day. Lady Pendants raised an eyebrow, clearly surprised. "That's unusual," she said with a small smile. "It seems I made the right choice hiring you." Riv nodded politely, forcing a smile, while inwardly praying her secret stayed buried for just a little longer. Rodeis was overwhelmed with confusion and uncertainty. 4 days had passed without any word, and she didn't know what to do next. Suddenly, a voice broke the silence. 4 days should have been enough time. She spun around to see Marquis Dimas Ditrion standing there. She froze, utterly dumbfounded, and immediately wondered what he was doing in front of her. Her mind raced, flashing back to the buyer of the nude painting, and a sinking feeling took hold. Gathering herself, she stammered that the situation was complicated, but assured him she would do whatever she could, given the painting's price. The Marquis raised an eyebrow and asked what exactly she planned to do about the painting and how she intended to resolve the matter. Confused, she asked why the painting was even there. He explained calmly that the artist had sold it the very next day and that the transaction had been finalized. Her heart sank further. She protested that the painting violated the original agreement. He countered sharply that disputes between an artist and their model weren't the buyer's concern. Stunned, Riv asked if he hadn't expressed some willingness to consider the model's reasons for refusal. Didn't that imply he had intended to be considerate? The Marquis nodded slightly but added that he had ultimately purchased the painting because of the model in it. Then his tone shifted as he asked coldly, "And on what grounds does a governess in the Baron Pendants household speak to me like this?" Her stomach dropped. His words, and the way he said them, made her suspect that he knew she was the model. Was he testing her? Trying to make her admit it? Worse, what if he was close to the Baroness? She dreaded the thought of her employer visiting his home and seeing the painting. There was no way out. Hesitantly, she admitted she was the model in the painting. The Marquis didn't react the way she expected. Instead, he asked how he was supposed to believe her and if she had any proof. Flustered, she told him that Brett could testify, but he only scoffed, questioning what would stop both her and the artist from lying. He also pointed out that he had heard the model was adamant about keeping her identity hidden. Riv's mind raced as she tried to think of a way to convince him. Words weren't enough. She needed undeniable proof. With her heart pounding, she made a decision. Meeting his gaze, she told him he wanted evidence, and without waiting for a response, she shifted her posture and posed exactly as she had in the painting. The Marquis stared, his expression unreadable. After a moment of silence, he muttered dryly, "Well, that's convincing. Though I have to admit this is not how I imagined resolving a dispute over fine art." Riv took off her clothes to prove she was the model. The Marquis studied her and said the pose didn't match the painting. Embarrassed but determined, she adjusted herself, reminding herself to endure the shame for the sake of reclaiming the painting. She added small details to mimic the exact position. After a moment, he told her she could dress. Once she was clothed again, he stated that she wouldn't be able to pay for the painting anyway. She begged for more time, but he refused, saying he wanted the painting. She pleaded again, desperate for a solution, and he finally said the painting could be redone without the model's face. She asked if that would satisfy him, and he agreed, saying she could have the original if she provided a replacement. She hesitated, explaining that Brett worked quickly, and she wasn't sure if the quality would be the same. He said there was one condition: he wanted to observe the process. Her face turned pale, but she realized she had no choice but to agree. She was lost in thought about her conversation with the Marquis when Million called her name, snapping her back to reality. She quickly composed herself and asked what was going on. Million tilted her head, curious about why her tutor seemed so distracted, but carried on with her story, mentioning that her painting classes would start next week. Riv raised an eyebrow, commenting that it was the first time Million had shown any real interest in learning. Million grinned and admitted it was because of the Marquis. She wanted to have a reason to talk to him, knowing how much he loved art. Riv nodded, saying it made sense since the Marquis often visited to see what the pendant's family purchased. Million pouted, adding that her father wouldn't let her anywhere near him to avoid disturbing him. With a mischievous glint in her eye, Million asked what the Marquis was like up close, wondering aloud if he was as majestic as a statue carved by God himself. Riv chuckled, saying she had only caught a brief glimpse, and smoothly redirected Million's attention back to studying. Million groaned, muttering about the endless need for lessons. Privately, Riv couldn't deny that the Marquis was captivating, but what lingered in her mind wasn't his appearance, it was his unreadable, piercing gaze. Her thoughts were interrupted again when Million leaned closer and asked if she'd heard the rumors. Riv raised an eyebrow. "What rumors?" Million hesitated for a moment before lowering her voice. "Everyone knows he loves art, but they say there's something else he truly collects." Brett was invited to the Marquis's estate to redo the painting. He marveled at the tools set up for him, saying he'd never imagined working in such a place. Riv was lost in her thoughts, noting how the estate was surrounded by mountains and vast plains. The staff's loyalty ensured that whatever happened there stayed within the grounds, and she couldn't help but think that someone could get away with anything there. Her mind briefly flashed to the rumor cess, Million had mentioned about a hidden room in the basement where people were preserved as specimens. She quickly dismissed the thought, telling herself it was nonsense. It was just a painting, after all. But she couldn't shake the feeling that there was something more to the Marquis's request to observe the process. Just then the Marquis entered, telling them he had ordered everything to be prepared in advance so their work wouldn't be interrupted. He asked if they needed anything else. Brett responded, saying everything was more than enough, almost too much, and that it was truly an honor. He promised to create a masterpiece for the Marquis. The Marquis then turned to her and asked if she planned to pose for a nude painting while covered. Before she could answer, Brett quickly intervened, assuring the Marquis that she wouldn't be covered and whispered for her to undress quickly. She thought to herself that he was trying too hard to impress the Marquis and felt he was being overly insistent. Still, with the Marquis there, she couldn't argue. The Marquis asked if Brett was always so heavy-handed while working, commenting that while he understood artists were sensitive, it was rather grating. Brett immediately apologized, promising to correct himself. She wondered if clients usually criticized artists like this, and briefly entertained the thought that perhaps the Marquis had asked to observe just to find fault with the process, but she dismissed it. He gave the order to begin, and as she assumed her posture, she thought about how tedious painting could be. She hoped he would tire of watching soon. The painting session began, with Brett guiding her on how to hold her posture and promising it would be finished soon. As they worked, the Marquis suddenly dropped his glass of wine. Brett rushed over to check on him, asking if he was all right. The Marquis explained that his hand had slipped. Brett quickly ran out to find a servant, ignoring her request to wait. Left alone with the Marquis, she felt uncomfortable. Even though it wasn't the first time she had posed like this, his gaze felt different, uncomfortably intense, like his eyes were touching her. She wondered how long he had been watching her. When Brett returned, he explained he couldn't find a servant. The Marquis decided it was time to call it a day. Brett begged for a little more time to finish, but the Marquis ignored him. As they left together, she noticed how empty the vast mansion felt. She mentioned it, but he explained that the staff had likely withdrawn to avoid disturbing them. She found it odd, especially since the glass falling looked more like it had been punched rather than accidentally dropped. He brushed off her concerns, suggesting the Marquis just liked the place quiet and that the mishap hadn't affected their work. As they walked, she couldn't shake the silence of the mansion, just as he'd said. Suddenly, she heard her name being called. The Marquis was summoning her. Startled, she shouted that she was coming, wondering why it felt like she'd drawn unwanted attention to herself. Despite her doubts and unease, the painting continued with the Marquis overseeing every detail. However, he kept interrupting with a series of small accidents. Frustrated, she complained to Brett, saying something was off because there had been too many interruptions, and they hadn't even finished the sketch after days of work. Brett reassured her, saying he'd work faster and that he had originally thought they'd be done quickly. Later, Million ran toward her, thanking her for coming to her birthday party. She wished Million a happy birthday, thinking to herself that she only came because she couldn't ignore the invitation. As she stood there, the guests murmured, making her feel uncomfortable as their stares lingered. Hoping to avoid more attention, she tried to slip to the back and leave quietly. In her haste, she bumped into a young man who cautioned her to be careful. She quickly apologized. He asked if she was Miss Rodeis, which shocked her for a moment. He introduced himself as Carmyle Marcel, and she remembered he was Million's art teacher. He mentioned how Million often spoke highly of her and that he had been eager to meet her. He expressed his pleasure in introducing himself, and she thanked him for his kind words. He asked her to call him by his first name, but she hesitated, finding it a bit forward. He explained he wanted to address her as Riv. She pointed out that they had just met and insisted they should keep things formal. He quickly apologized for making her uncomfortable and admitted he had gotten ahead of himself. He explained he wanted her guidance on teaching methods. She dismissed the idea of any particular methods. But he then asked for advice on maintaining boundaries, saying it was his first time teaching a young lady, and he wanted to be cautious. He offered to accept her advice in a letter if meeting in person was a burden. Understanding his concern, she said she might share a bit about Million. When he asked for her address, she thought he seemed like a good person and handed it to him. Just then, the noise from the crowd drew her attention as the Marquis entered the mansion. She wondered why he was there. Carmyle remarked that it was surprising since the Marquis disliked crowded places. She asked if he knew much about him, but he replied he only knew what others did. Lady Pendance expressed her gratitude for his presence, saying it was the best birthday gift for Million, as she had always wanted to meet him. Seeing Million's wish fulfilled made her smile. However, the guests began murmuring, questioning if the Marquis had come just for the birthday. They speculated there must be a more important reason, or that the Baron had somehow persuaded him. Some even suggested the Baron seemed too pleased, as if he were trying to arrange something between Million and the Marquis. She thought about how Million would feel if she heard those rumors. Her mind drifted to her former student and the accusation of seducing the Viscount's eldest son. The shame of that memory overwhelmed her, and she felt dizzy. She nearly collapsed, but was caught by Carmyle, who asked if she was all right. She assured him it was just dizziness and quickly decided to leave. 3 days later, she received a letter from the Baron informing her that lessons would be on hold because Million was unwell. He promised to notify her when they would resume. She worried about what had happened to Million and realized that with lessons on hold, her tutor fees would stop, making it difficult to manage her expenses for the next month. As she thought about this, Croydon walked past her. She asked if she needed anything, but Croydon said she was fine. Suddenly, Croydon started coughing violently, coughing up blood. Alarmed, she kept asking if she was all right. Roids asked where her sister's medicine was, and Croydon replied that it was finished. Turning to the table, Roids stared at the little money she had left. She picked it up, told her sister to wait, and quickly left. Running to the pharmacy, she arrived out of breath. The pharmacist looked at her and mentioned he had wondered why she hadn't come sooner. She asked him to get the medicine quickly, but he told her to catch her breath, saying rushing wouldn't make the medicine appear any faster. He added that at the rate she was going, she might collapse before her sister. As she waited, she noticed a newspaper on the counter with an article about a drug. Curious, she asked the pharmacist about it. He explained there had been an announcement about a new drug that was reportedly very effective for people with illnesses like Croydon's and might even cure them completely. Her eyes widened as she asked where she could get it. He told her it wouldn't be available in small pharmacies like his, and that it was 10 times more expensive than the regular medicine. She thought about how hard it already was to afford the cheaper one. The pharmacist pointed out that, since she worked for noble families, she might be able to use her connections to access the drug. He added that they both knew what she could afford, and suggested she consider improving her life. He said she could catch the eye of a decent suitor, which might help her care for her sister and manage her burdens. He told her she couldn't take care of her sick sister alone forever, and urged her not to shut people out. He said she needed someone by her side. She took the medicine and told him she was leaving. As she walked away, he called out, telling her not to dismiss his advice and to think about it. As she walked, she told herself not to be weak and to stay strong. Suddenly, she stumbled and fell, dropping the medicine. Panicked, she pleaded with people passing by not to step on it. Tears rolled down her face as she scrambled to gather it from the ground. Late that night, she thought about how exhausting the day had been. She was grateful that the medicine helped her sister through the worst of it, but she wondered how much longer they could manage like this. After laying Croydon to rest, she went to the church, the only place where she could find peace. As she sat there, she murmured softly, admitting to herself that she didn't believe in God because he had never answered her prayers. She thought about how, as a commoner entering a prestigious boarding school, she had faced everything alone. When her parents passed away and she had to move from one tutoring job to another, God was never on her side. Now, with Croydon as her only family, it felt like even that was being taken away. She wished someone would tell her she had done well and support her so she wouldn't collapse from exhaustion. All she ever wanted was someone to lean on. Tears fell as she wept. Suddenly, she noticed a handkerchief drop onto her lap. Surprised, she looked up and saw Marquis Ditrion standing before her. She called out his name in shock. He told her that while God may listen, he does not grant wishes. He said it was humans who had the power to make things happen. He told her to pray to him instead, saying that perhaps she might receive a miracle. She admitted to herself that the words he spoke sounded so sweet. She wondered if the Marquis could truly answer a prayer even when God ignored hers. But the thought also crept in, what if he was only saying this to torment her because he thought so little of her? He called her name and reminded her that she always kept people waiting. Then he turned to leave. She suddenly shouted that she needed money, but quickly apologized, saying it was a slip of the tongue. She asked if he could lift the clause in her contract with Brett so she could take on other modeling jobs. After speaking, she grew silent, worried that her words might displease him or that he might use this as an excuse to get back at her. He asked if she would consider working extra hours, promising to compensate her generously. She responded with confusion, asking him to clarify. He told her he expected an answer and that she should return the handkerchief on her next shift. Then he left. She wondered what he meant by extra hours and thought her life seemed to be heading in an unexpected direction. The next day, she visited him at his place. She handed him the handkerchief and said she was ready to hear the details about the extra hours he had proposed. He told her he wouldn't explain unless she promised to do it and didn't want any unnecessary chatter. She agreed, saying she would do it. He then informed her that someone would be waiting outside to explain and have her sign the contract. He said he looked forward to working with her. A young man explained the extra hours to her. She would need to be in a room with the Marquis while undressed. Shocked, she asked what he meant. He reassured her that was all it involved. She wouldn't have to do anything beyond that, nor would she be put in danger. However, he pointed out that since she had verbally agreed, the Marquis would not accept a refusal. As she prepared to start, the Marquis thought about her. To him, she looked as solemn as a soldier heading into battle. He remembered when he first saw the painting. What caught his eye was the model awkwardly showing her back. Her uneasy posture carried a lingering sense of shame. Her bare back expressed despair. Though the painting itself was poor, it intrigued him. He had even hinted to the painter to capture her face as best as possible. He was curious about the expression a woman with such a back would have. As he reflected, his maid entered and asked if she should send the handkerchief to the laundry. He told her to throw it away, saying it still had the nauseating smell of paint. He then remarked that he was curious to see how the poor model would fare. He asked about her whereabouts and was informed that she was signing the contract. He ordered that she be brought to him once she was done, as they would start that day. The maid informed her where the Marquis was. As she approached the room, she thought about the place. Everything was so white, almost to an obsessive degree. It was well known that the Marquis had a compulsion for cleanliness. He always wore gloves, and no one had ever seen his bare hands. There were rumors about him being skilled in taxidermy or accustomed to killing, but those might have been exaggerated tales fueled by the mystery surrounding him. She wouldn't be surprised if such a man had strange hobbies or a dark private life. She hesitated at the door, knowing he was behind it. Before she could knock, she heard his voice telling her to come in. Startled, she wondered how he knew she was there. She encouraged herself, reminding herself that it was just extra work and the pay was generous. She stepped inside. The room was stark and intimidating. She undressed as required, her thoughts flashing back to what she was told about the contract. She wondered if this was all she needed to do for the amount of money stated. The Marquis seemed in a bad mood, and she began to question if she had missed something she was supposed to do. At least, she thought, he seemed to like her body. She asked if that was all she was supposed to do. He responded by asking if his aide had forced her to sign the contract without explaining. She told him the aide had said she only needed to spend time with him while undressed. He confirmed that was correct. She admitted she thought he might want something more. He seemed offended and remarked that he had thought she was different from the other women who followed him, but now he saw he was mistaken. She quickly explained that she didn't mean it that way, but added that the situation wasn't exactly normal. He acknowledged her point, saying his tastes were uncommon, which was why he paid her to sit before him. Then, with a tone of disdain, he told her to stay quiet and be a pretty flower for him, adding that she wasn't quite worthy of being called a statue yet. She thought about the blatant sneer in his words. From the moment she signed the contract, he had shown no intention of maintaining even basic respect. It seemed he needed someone to insult freely, not as a person but as a fool. She told herself she was used to such treatment. Later, she met with the young man who took Million for her art class, Carmyle. He noticed she seemed quiet and asked if he had asked too much of her. She told him she only had something on her mind. He asked if it was something important, but she assured him it wasn't. She thought about how one day of work with the Marquis meant she didn't have to worry about rent or medicine for the month. Still, she felt so tired. Carmyle apologized if he had burdened her with his worries. She reassured him that he hadn't, and mentioned that the reason Million had stopped the lessons wasn't due to his teaching methods. She said she had received the same notification. Hearing this, he said he must have been too hasty, but knowing the truth made him feel better. She said she was glad she had someone to talk to about Million. Then she mentioned it was getting late and suggested they leave. He offered to pay for the coffee since he had asked for the meeting. She questioned him, and he added that if it bothered her so much, she could treat him next time. As he stretched out a hand to help her up, She thought about how kind he was, showing consideration in small ways without making a fuss. She reflected that if she were younger and in better circumstances, she might have felt something for him. But as she stood, she stumbled and fell onto him. Immediately, she heard her name being called. The voice calling her name turned out to be Brett. He waved at her and remarked how fancy it was seeing her there. Leaning closer, he whispered, asking who the man she was with was. She explained that he was Million's art teacher and that they were discussing teaching methods. Brett then turned to the man, asking him to take care of their Riv. The man simply replied in agreement. Brett mentioned that he was also a painter. Hearing this, the teacher responded with mild interest. Brett continued, saying that painting was a challenging yet invigorating pursuit for artists. She interrupted Brett, reminding him that he might be leaving his companion waiting. Brett acknowledged this, noting how forgetful he was. He leaned closer again, whispering to her that just between them he thought something good was about to happen. Wishing her well, he left. She glanced at his companion and thought to herself that the man didn't seem like Brett's usual crowd. The teacher noted the unexpected connection and asked if she knew Brett. She asked if he also knew him. He replied, describing Brett as an artist who had failed at every exhibition, but had recently been boasting about newfound wealth. She thought to herself about this new patron and wondered if it could possibly be Lord Dittrion. Since that day, she began to observe Brett and the Marquis more closely during her painting sessions. Their interactions seemed normal, leaving her to wonder if it was just Brett spreading rumors. One day at the Marquis's house, she found herself watching him for a while. He noticed and asked if she had something to say. She denied it, but added that she always saw him drinking. He offered her a glass, pouring one before she could refuse. Not wanting to seem disinterested, she accepted. He told her it was quite sweet, but when she tasted it, she remarked that it wasn't sweet at all. He noticed and asked if she drank regularly. She admitted she wasn't used to it. He cautioned her to be careful, reminding her to keep enough of her senses to dress herself later, since he didn't have room to house a drunkard overnight. That night, the Marquis fell into a deep sleep but was disturbed by a terrible dream. His maid woke him, informing him that his bath was ready. As he rose, he reflected on his belief that God does not save humankind. Only humankind can save itself. The Marquis sat in his bath, lost in deep thought. Even after everything was over, the marks on his body still hurt from time to time. Sometimes he could smell blood and feel the crawling sensation of bugs all over his skin, pulling him back to that day. In those moments, he would think of an unblemished, untouched body, and it would bring him some peace. Until now, that calm had only been found in art. He had never experienced it with a living human body. Then, a memory flashed through his mind, the image of wine dripping from Miss Rodeis' mouth. He muttered aloud that it wasn't bad at all, but as the thought lingered, he shouted, saying he must be going mad. Meanwhile, Croydon was busy reading a book when her sister entered, calling her name. Rodeis held something in her hand and demanded to know what it was and why it had been hidden under the bed. Croydon, startled, asked why her belongings were being searched. Snatching the basket from her sister, she said it was nothing. Rodeis, however, accused her of working behind her back, asking what would happen if she got hurt. She reminded her sister that she bled easily and said it was dangerous to handle things like that. She told her she was supposed to focus on taking care of herself, not earning money, as she had promised to handle that. Croydon explained that she just wanted to be helpful. She said she saw how much her sister was struggling and thought if she could help, maybe Rodeis could rest a bit. She admitted she wished she could live normally like everyone else, if not for her illness, and not be a burden. Rodeis hugged her and apologized for being harsh. Croydon insisted she was the one who should apologize. Rodeis reassured her, promising that she would get better soon. She mentioned a new medicine and vowed to find a way to cure her illness. Determined, Rodeis went to Hylop, one of the largest apothecaries in Borno, hoping to find information about the new medicine. As she approached the entrance, a security guard stopped her. He asked if she had a reservation and said he needed to verify her details before letting her in. When she admitted she didn't have one, He explained that Hylop stored sensitive medicines and only allowed entry to those with reservations. She handed him a newspaper article discussing the new medicine and asked how she could get a reservation. He apologized and told her all the slots were already booked. Looking into a mirror nearby, she stared at herself and thought how she hadn't anticipated this. Of course, a place designed for nobles wouldn't accept someone like her. Her mind wandered back to what a pharmacist had once told her, that she could use her connections since she worked for a noble. Then, her thoughts drifted to the day in the church when the Marquis had told her to pray to him for her miracle. She found herself questioning why he came to mind at that moment. The Marquis wanted to know more about Miss Rodeis, so he asked his aide to investigate her. The aide reported that her time at Clemen's boarding school had not been smooth. Being in a co-ed school and a commoner among nobles, she likely faced gossip. As for her previous jobs, she had a good reputation as a temporary teacher, but her roles as a governess were less favorable. At Viscount Karen's household, she was dismissed for allegedly trying to seduce the eldest son. At Count Lucette's, she was fired for supposed lack of teaching abilities. However, there seemed to be other reasons behind those decisions. Rumors had already spread as if they were facts. The Marquis responded that he now understood why she fled from the capital to the countryside. A woman without support is more vulnerable to gossip. After dismissing his aide, he remarked to himself that this would be an easy match. The more someone had to hide, the easier they were to manipulate. Walking down the street, Rodeis heard her name being called. It was Rita. She complained about how hard it was to catch her these days. Noticing the catalog from Hylop Apothecary in her hand, she expressed surprise, pointing out that people like them wouldn't dare step into such a place. She commented that things must be going well for her. When Rodeis asked what she meant, Rita explained that someone had seen her riding in a fancy carriage. Rodeis immediately realized it was the Marquis's carriage, which always took her to and from the estate. Rita asked if she was in trouble, noticing that she did not look happy. She replied that she was fine and only doing simple clerical work. Rita then asked if she was still working as a governess. Rodeis questioned where she had heard that, and Rita said she had only heard it as a rumor. Rodeis asked if she believed it, but Rita said she was only concerned because gossip was common in town. Rodeis dismissed it, saying that rumors were just rumors. When she arrived at the Marquis's estate for her extra hours, he immediately noticed her sighing. He asked if she found the work tedious. She apologized, saying she didn't mean to give that impression. He then directed her to a box nearby. Opening it, she found an expensive necklace. When she asked what it was, he told her to put it on, saying he thought it would suit her, just like the wine. He told her to keep it, but she was shocked. He said if wearing it felt burdensome, she could sell it. She responded that she couldn't sell such an expensive piece of jewelry. He reminded her that she had said she needed money. She replied that the extra payment he gave her was already more than enough, and a drastic change in her lifestyle would look suspicious. He remarked that her life already seemed suspicious, mentioning the luxurious carriage he provided, which had caused misunderstandings. He asked if she wanted him to walk her home himself. She quickly refused, saying she asked nothing of him. Pulling her gently with the necklace, he leaned closer and told her to ask something of him. She thought to herself that this wasn't a request but a command. Why did the Marquis keep wanting her to say such things? She asked him why she would make a demand of him. He asked her why she wouldn't. Then he told her he was curious and wondered how far someone who stood tall, even when stripped bare, could be pushed beyond their limits. She told him that if he disliked her, there were other ways to show it. He cut her off, saying he didn't understand why she thought he disliked her. Wasn't there more evidence to suggest she had caught his attention? She asked him what he meant. In her mind, she finally understood. This was just how he was. A man with a perverse taste for watching someone sit bare for hours. Someone who wielded arrogant and ruthless words as if it were his right. She told him she understood that he was curious about her, but she wasn't sure if that was a good thing. He replied that she was more difficult than expected. He added that her stiff posture showed she was just as rigid in character. He ended the conversation, saying that was enough for the day. After that day, the Marquise stopped coming to their painting sessions. The extra hours she worked were also halted indefinitely. To make up for lost time, Brett sped up his painting process, and her lessons with the girl resumed. The girl, clearly upset, admitted to her that she had a problem. She explained that the truth behind her missing classes was because she had fought with her friends. She asked if that was true, realizing there had indeed been something wrong. The girl explained that since the day the Marquis came to her birthday, her friends mocked her, saying she had bought his favor. In anger, she told them that the Marquis was not someone who could be bought with money, and that they were the ones being materialistic. Then they started crying. She asked the girl if she wanted to make up with her friends. She replied that the situation made her uncomfortable, even though her friends weren't bad people. She added that while the day was rough, she wanted to fix things. Acknowledging that the root cause of this trouble was likely the Marquis, and more precisely people's desires, she suggested the girl try. The girl thanked her, saying she would talk to her friends. She responded that it was splendid. Later, Rodeis found herself deep in thought about whether to accept the Marquis's favor. Returning to a normal life was what she wanted, but the decision wasn't simple. Walking alone on a deserted street, she noticed the quietness and began hearing footsteps. At first, she thought it was her imagination, but the steps became louder and more real. She realized someone was following her. She thought the rumors about her improved situation might have drawn attention. Regretting not being more careful, she felt a hand reaching for her. Forcing her way out, she wondered if anyone would come if she screamed. Considering throwing the money she had to distract the pursuer, she stumbled and fell. Realizing screaming might be useless, she saw the attacker raise a piece of wood to strike her. She heard herself call for help just as a shot rang out. The attacker fell, hit in the head. Shocked, she wondered if he was dead, and who could have done such a thing. She felt a hand touch her from behind. Shocked, she turned around, only to see the Marquis's aide. He asked if she was all right, and told her to come with him as the Marquis was waiting for her. He led her to him and explained that she had twisted her ankle when she fell but would be fine with enough rest. The Marquis asked if she had any wounds. After the aide left, he asked again if she was all right. She expressed her deep gratitude, saying she didn't know how to repay his kindness. He told her the area was unsafe. She said it wasn't usually like that and added that the alley wasn't normally rough. He told her the problem was that she had become a target, likely due to the misunderstandings they had discussed earlier. He then promised to arrange accommodations for her. She fell to her knees and said that was far too much. He observed that she didn't seem to welcome his interest. Then he asked her if she could confidently say she could continue living as she had. He warned her there was no guarantee incidents like today wouldn't happen again, and each time she would have to rely on luck to escape. He reminded her that their contract stipulated her service was required until he no longer needed it. He added that he didn't want her neglecting her duties over trivial matters and that he intended to teach her unscathed. He told her it was fortunate he happened to be in her neighborhood that day. She asked why he was there, and he said she had been calling for him desperately. He added that if he had known she would get hurt, he would have acted faster. Thinking about it, she asked if he had been the one who fired the shot. His mind drifted back to a few hours earlier, when he and his aide were watching as she was being chased. He had taken his gun and fired at the attacker when he was at the perfect range. He asked if she still sought God in the chapel, then informed her that he had indeed been the one who fired the shot. He remarked that it had been a while since he had felt the thrill of victory. She and her sister moved into the new house he had arranged. Her sister was surprised and asked if they were really going to live there. She asked her if she liked it, and her sister answered that she did. For a while, peaceful days followed. They now lived in a safe and warm place, free from danger. There was also a plentiful supply of medicine for her sister. One day, as they sat at the dining table, her sister asked if she was going to work, and wished her a nice day. She thanked her for the kind words. In her thoughts, she admitted that everything she enjoyed the safety, the comfort, and her sister's well-being was all because of his interest in her. And she needed it. Miss Rodeis yelled at Brett because he said he couldn't go for the painting work that day. She worried if the Marquis had approved it, but he explained that he had delivered a letter yesterday. She pointed out that this wasn't just any job and reminded him that he had been working on it lately, asking why he had suddenly changed his mind. He told her he was feeling unwell. She asked him to be honest with her for once. And he admitted that finishing the work quickly would be problematic. When she asked how, he explained that completing it would end his connection with the Marquis, and he hadn't secured a patronage contract yet. Surprised, she asked why he needed a patronage contract and if he had been gambling again. He assured her he hadn't and told her the truth, that while drunk he caught the eye of a wealthy nobleman and mentioned securing a patron. Her thoughts drifted to what Carmyle had said, and she imagined he might have been using the Marquis's name. Brett told her about the man he had been with the other day, thus explaining that he was a famous businessman who offered to sell his paintings in the capital and even hold an exhibition for him. However, since he hadn't debuted yet, he needed proof of his skill, a guarantee of some sort. She thought that, even with that reason, he was going too far. He explained that the money for the venue's rent, which he had already paid, would be waived if he could bring a patronage contract. Surprised, she asked if he had really paid for the venue. She questioned whether he thought all of this sounded suspicious. He yelled back that she must think he was an idiot because he hadn't debuted yet. She told him that wasn't what she meant, but he cut her off, saying the Marquis only asked him to paint because he liked his work. He insisted he just needed more time, as his next piece would involve a groundbreaking oil painting technique that would captivate the Marquis. At the Marquis's home, he read Brett's letter and said that if the painter was too ill to work, there was no need for her to come either. He asked if she had come all the way just to tell him that. She replied it was partially the reason and also to express her gratitude for his kindness. He reminded her that she had already thanked him the very day it happened. Miss Rodeis thought about how the Marquis had only seen her as an accessory until now, never anything more. Yet his words stayed with her. He had said it was strange how she seemed like she would be all right, even if a little tarnished. She reflected on the tension between them, knowing she wasn't naive enough to ignore it completely. Wanting to shift the conversation, she asked if he had attended a lady named Million's birthday party. She pointed out that his presence there had sparked much speculation. She told him that she didn't know him very well, but had heard that he didn't mingle much with the nobility, so she wondered why he had attended the event. He responded by asking why she cared. She explained that she was Million's governess and that since he had visited, the girl's life had been in turmoil. She said she was simply a teacher concerned about her students' well-being. He told her he had gone to the party to see her because the person she was there seemed different from the one he knew. This made her wonder if he had truly attended the party just to see her. She found it hard to believe and said so, but he remarked that her response was rather lackluster. She admitted that she wasn't sure how to interpret his interest in her. He told her he hardly thought about it and left it up to her. She reflected on how he had always treated her differently. A part of her wondered if he liked her, but another part doubted it. She decided to change the subject and told him about her sick sister. He remarked that it was unfortunate. She mentioned hearing about a new drug from the Dominion Medical Institute that could improve her sister's condition, but she had no way to obtain it. She asked if he could help her find information about it, but quickly changed her request to ask if he could help with her sister's treatment. She said she would do anything. He told her she had no value to offer him, but then paused and added that there might actually be something. He complimented her, saying she amazed him, and told her to keep entertaining him. If she did, Fortune would visit her doorstep every day. He offered to introduce her sister to a good doctor. Later, when she and her sister arrived at Berryworth Mansion, they were greeted by a butler who introduced himself as Philip Philmond. He asked to be called Philip. Her sister introduced herself as well, As he walked them in, he asked if they liked fruit tarts. When Royds said yes, she couldn't help but notice how warm and welcoming the mansion felt compared to the other properties of the Marquis. Philip mentioned the large arboretum and glass greenhouse behind the mansion, saying it was his pride and joy. He added that it was a lovely place for a walk and encouraged them to visit it sometime. She agreed, saying it sounded wonderful. Her sister, however, seemed to have her thoughts elsewhere. She asked if the owner of the mansion was the one helping them and what he looked like. Royds assured her it was the same person. Croydon commented that there were others in the world who were also unfortunate, yet someone who lived in such a grand mansion was quick to help them. She wondered aloud if he might want something else, perhaps her sister's beauty. Royds thought to herself that the Marquis did not want anything like that from them, though it was close to the truth in another sense. Philip led them to meet the Marquis, but Royds cautioned that her sister had bad experiences with doctors and might get scared. Her sister confidently assured her that she was fine and told her not to worry. Philip then asked if they were ready to meet the master. As they approached the room, Royds overheard a conversation inside. Someone was speaking to the Marquis, saying they still hadn't received the message and asking what they should do. The Marquis responded, asking if he should consider their feelings before ordering them to reject the proposal. The atmosphere felt different to Royds, and something told her that the Marquis was displeased. She wondered if this was a bad time. He turned to her and asked if she could ride. She said yes, explaining that she had taken a few lessons. He then asked if they could go for a hunt. Out on the field, Miss Royds asked the Marquis if he truly liked hunting. He replied that he did not, explaining that it was something he did because he had to. He told her that sometimes taking a life was unavoidable. Seeing the shock on her face, he asked if it was her first time witnessing someone shoot. She told him she had never been exposed to it before. He remarked that she must have been raised delicately. She replied that if she had been, she wouldn't be there with him. He laughed and said he had a feeling she was only doing this to keep him company. She thought to herself that he was right and admitted it aloud. She also thought about how their bond seemed to be growing, and, if she were honest, she was secretly pleased by it. He noted how quickly she admitted it. She explained that she had already thought long and hard about his interest in her. When he asked what she had decided, she told him she had chosen to accept it. She said she would come when called and leave when told. If he offered help, she would take it. He then asked what she would do if he told her to undress. Without hesitation, she said she would. He instructed her to signal for everyone to return, saying they would finish the hunt there. She was about to ask if the hunt was over, but he interrupted, reminding her of her earlier words about undressing. He then asked if she preferred the outdoors for such an act. Later, it was reported that her sister's examination had been completed. Royds watched anxiously as the Marquis discussed the results with the doctor. He noticed her worry and remarked that people might think she was the patient. He asked why she was still concerned, especially since the examination had gone well and her sister was not so young anymore. She explained that a doctor had once bled her sister excessively, nearly killing her, and that the same doctor had insisted on exploratory surgery on her sister's head. He called that doctor a quack and reassured her that the physician he had provided was highly skilled, his personal doctor, and there was no need to worry. She expressed her gratitude. He offered her a smoke, mentioning that it helped lift his spirits. As he smoked, his thoughts drifted to memories of the war. He recalled the horrible sensations it left him with, and the recurring urges for violence, which seemed to be suppressed only by witnessing death and the cold stillness of a body. Noticing that she appeared uncomfortable, he commented that perhaps it was too much for her. He then added that she would learn from him, drawing closer as he spoke and kissed her. If you're eager for the next chapter, drop a comment expressing your interest in a part 2. Don't forget to subscribe and ensure to hit the notification bell to stay updated. Until next time.